a thought here. One thing that we could do, I did pull up my Onyx and I've hidden all my waypoints and everything else that's important. But
Oh,
what we could do is can I share? I should be able to share my screen on here, right?
yeah, you should. Oh
Okay.
God,
So
we're gonna get a look into Jake Bush's Onyx. That's just.
while it's blank, so but yeah, watch
Is
all
this your?
the points pop up.
This could be your
My
burner
burner
account too.
account. It is. It's my burner account. So what we'll do, let's just pick a state, right? I got one pulled up here, but let me come in here real quick and share. I'm not a
It's gonna
Google.
be like my backyard.
Let me see if you can see this.
Share the specific tab too, so you're not like that way. It won't million screen it when you're sharing our faces.
So does that look right?
Nice. Yep, that's great.
Okay,
Mark
perfect.
Twain National Forest. Are you sure you want to
Yeah.
break down public?
So this is, I mean, man, this is Missouri. Pick the state. Like
I
pick a
mean,
state
go.
and we'll go through and we'll do a little bit of scouting.
Oh man.
And what we'll do, we'll identify some betting points and then we'll identify, like, we'll pick an area, a system based on a couple different factors, right? Like, let's find
Mm-hmm.
some good food sources. Let's find some good access. Let's find where we think there'd be bedding. Like, I think you do the same thing I do. I typically will mark where I think beds will be or where I think a scrape will be, and then
Mm-hmm.
I have like some destinations, and then we'll go through like, hey, if there is a deer bedded here, this is how I would access into this spot based off of a map, right? It's not going to be perfect, but we could probably get pretty close.
Yeah.
So, I
So
mean, man, pick the state.
I mean, I'm good with Missouri for the hills. What I'm thinking is we pick two scenarios. One where it's rather steep tops and they're narrow, and then one where it's more flats with eggs on top with ag on top. And I'll direct you right where to go for private land with that. Um, but for a narrow top kind of situation, if this lines up, go for it right here
Okay.
because I
So
think they
what
hunt
I'm
a little
really,
bit different.
yeah, so what I'm really looking for is I want to find, like you said, narrow top, steeper ridges, and I want ag in the bottom, right? Like I think that's, yeah, everybody probably knows that knows that at this point. But and then we'll do the inverse, what you're kind of used to, and we'll see how we break those down different. So, do you not want to do public? I've never even looked at this part of Missouri before. So I just basically
I
opened up my map, turned on the public, and I was like, oh, there's ag in the bottom.
Yeah, I just wouldn't do public just because there's going to be like three guys that listen to this that hunt that area and they're going to curse us until the end of time.
That's
But
fair. So we're
yeah,
going to be close to some, but we're not going to break down the public, right? Is that fair?
turn off your private land layers cuz now we can just draw a border and that way we aren't, mentally limited from it right away. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I like that. I think
Cuz
that's
now
a good
you can
idea.
just pick a giant ridge system and call it a property.
Yeah. Okay. So right off the bat, I already picked where I want to be. So everybody picks on me. Basically, when I'm navigating my Onyx and I'm not sponsored for or paid by Onyx, I still pay my membership. So this is just what I like to use because to me it's the easiest to navigate and has the best functionality. So that's my that's why I use it the most. I do use a bunch of other apps, but like when I'm searching for broad areas, I typically will use Onyx. So I'll normally navigate in hybrid mode, and then when I want to get really fine tuned, I actually switch over to Topo a lot. And everybody picks on me when they see my map on my phone because they're like, "How do you navigate with that?" But just over time, I've just kind of figured it out. I guess. I mean, it makes sense to my eyeballs at this point. So what I look for, this is basically any state that I go to that's in the hill country, just because it makes sense to me in my head. But I want to find areas that have fairly narrow ridges. Like ideally, they're not bluffy ridges because the travel that I've seen isn't as concentrated. So I like to find like steep terrain, narrow ridges. If there's cliffs are great, and then a lot of topography change leading down to ag. So as you can see right here, Jacob, you can see this, right?
Mhm.
Okay. So as you can see right here, this whole system where my cursor's at is running out towards the east. And the reason why I always focus on these right off the bat is because typically you'll have wind blowing from, let's say, south to north or from west to east or like a southwest wind like that. And so that sets up very well for bedding on ridges like this on any of these subpoints and any of these hollows. And then I'll get a lot of good movement down to ag at the right time of year, typically early season. You know, if it's corn, if it's beans, if it's alfalfa, hay fields, it really doesn't matter. I see a lot of downward movement to ag if the ag is still something that they want to feed on. So that's basically where I start out. I'm gonna have to get used to the buttons on the laptop. It's been a while, but um, so for instance, let's start out by kind of blocking off this whole area. I'll do that. Discard that. So what I'll typically do is come up with an area pretty broad that I want to look at. I'll say like, okay, all of this right here leads to ag. And if you were to look at my Onyx maps, I always leave these because it gives me a good reference. A lot of times I'll actually draw them on the public private boundaries just so I really have a good definition of where I'm at. Okay, so I'll always do that. That way, when I zoom out, I can get a really good look of the area and see if it makes sense to me. And like, okay, where are these deer going to be? What does access look like from a 10,000-foot view? And then I'll start working in on it if I like the setup. Like this setup, I would love to hunt this area. So things I'm looking for right away. I know that every situation's different. There's a lot of guys that will kill a deer in 100 different manners in the hills, but for me, one of the things that I like that gives me confidence is I like it when there's not a lot of roads on the ridge tops. I like when you have to access from the bottom as often as possible. So what that does, it makes access more difficult, right? Like it's more of a challenge to be able to get into the hills going up the hills as opposed to dropping off a road. There is a road way back here where my cursor's at on top, but I'm not overly concerned with that one. Like they would have to scale, the top of this ridge all the way out. Could somebody do it? Sure. But is it likely? Probably not. So what I would do after that is I would try to identify, is this actually an ag field? So I'd come in and look at it real close. A lot of times you can actually see like if it's corn rows or if it's bean rows. If you go back in historical data, you can see the crop rotation, which is always nice. And if it looks like ag to me, great. Now I have a food source. So, say this whole front is ag. Well, that gives me a lot of different options for feeding. So now I'll start my next step. So there's always, typically you're going to have acorns in the hardwoods, and that's something that I'm very interested in. But just when I start my scouting, I like to hunt areas that have some sort of ag because I'm trying to stack as many factors as possible into putting a big deer in that area or a lot of deer with a chance of one of them being big. And so, clear cuts, any ag source nearby. And then we'll get into mast when we actually get out there and start looking at the trees. But that's kind of what's going through my head is how can I stack as many factors as possible? Like if this was ag, but there was roads on top, maybe I'm not as interested in it. Or if this was loaded with clear cuts in this bowl, maybe that gets me really fired up, and I definitely make that a priority to go in there because they have good browse, they have more cover to bed. That just makes a lot of sense in my head. I've had a lot of success in areas like that. So what I would do at this point is I would try to determine how I want to scout this. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll actually draw another line or like a thinner line, and I'll come down through and just like, set up some general sense of scouting direction. Like, hey, I want to start here. I want to go down through these ridges, and that'll give me a good idea of the mileage for the day too. So especially out of state, like, I might pick, let's say 5 of these and go to Illinois, for example, say, hey, I'm going to scout all 5 of these. If I don't map out my routes, I know for me looking at hills and hill country on a map, my eyes are always bigger than my stomach. And I get out there and I end up like, man, this is way too much land to try to navigate and actually pay any attention to anything.
That is
right?
exactly what happens to me every single time. I'm
Yeah.
like,
So
yeah,
I
I'm gonna get to these like 8 bedding areas, and I'm gonna set out these 8 cameras in these areas that I've picked out, and I'm like, at the end of the day, I'm at like 4. It
yeah.
just
I deal with the exact same thing. And so I try to just give me some sort of general mileage. I'm not going to stick to it, but it gives me an idea. Can I actually attain what I want to in a day or not? So what I would do at this point is I would identify where I think there will be bedding and then where I think some of the best bedding will be. And just put down some basic pins. I try not to overdo it because, you could put a pin on each one of these sub ridges. But to
Mhm.
me, like looking at this already, this is so appealing because of how many little sub ridges there are. You have your main spine of your ridge, which I talk about. This one's running west to east. So you have a north slope, which on a south wind for a big buck, that's great bedding if it sets up right for if he has cover and lack of pressure and then he has some sort of food source nearby. I almost guarantee you there's some beds on these sub ridges somewhere in here. So I'll start on the leeward side more often than not. That's kind of my goal. So let's put some pins down. We'll do. I've I've become really fond of hunting like bowl systems over the last few years. Like you got your main ridge, and that's great. And I do see a lot of good bedding there. I've killed some bucks coming off of these points before. But
Mhm.
now one of the things I really like is like coming in like this on my access, and we'll get into this more later, but coming in and then starting to sneak up this ridge and getting either right in here or coming up this drainage and then popping up here and watching that buck come down through or watching them come off this down through the same way to come out and around. Like I really love when I call these like nooks, right? You have your main ridge and then you have like a nook or like a hidden bowl. And most people would look at this, if you talk about hubs, most guys are going to put their pin right there, right? And so what I've noticed over the last couple of years, there's been a ton of hub talk on podcasts. Starting to find a bunch of mock scrapes and cameras in the hub, like in the main hub where I used to kill a lot of deer.
Right.
So
So talk a bit about your differentiation between macro and micro hub.
so we're going to see that right now. If you come in here, this would be a macro hub to me. If you look at this system as a whole, you have a
Mhm.
ton of ridges that are dumping down into this. It's very easily identifiable. It's a great travel area for deer, for big bucks, whether it's early season, the rut, late season, you'll see a lot of traffic through there because there's so many trails off these ridges and then they have so many different routes they can take. But with the uptick in pressure in a lot of the areas that I'm hunting, I'm not seeing the same daylight movement and I'm not seeing the bedding. Like, for example, I killed my biggest buck ever bedding right here. And I came in the bottom like this and snuck up just like this. And he dropped down to the hub and I killed him just like that. But anymore, I mean, I go in that system, there's always a camera down here now. So now I'm chasing the big bucks back up in this micro hub. So if you look here, it's the same. If you were to blow this section up, it would look almost identical to this. You still have ridge, 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 ridge. But this is what? 30% or 40% of the scale of the major macro hub down the bottom, right? And
Mhm.
so I'm seeing a lot more cross traffic here as opposed to down here. And maybe these bucks are starting to they're not taking the easiest route like I've seen in the past in high pressure areas. They're staying up high and then they'll do something weird to get where they want to be. Like, for example, one thing that I've actually seen quite a bit now would be like buck bedding here, right? But he wants to be over, let's say he wants to come out here at night, or even if he wants to come out here. Well, I used to be able to hunt that deer. I still can sometimes. Each deer is different, and this changes all the time. Every deer is different. Every area has more or less pressure, uh, ground growth, cover, all that plays into this. But where I used to see a lot of success with a deer bedded here on a southwest, and I would come in and I could hunt that deer going to the ag. What I'm starting to see more of is that deer shifting back further, like on this point, and then he's doing what I call a hub hop. So I had a very good conversation with Justin Wright about the hub hop.
Mhm.
Um, and this is the way that he explained it to me. And I've tested the theory and it is something that's actually happening. I've got cameras on top of ridges on scrapes. that are getting even wind shift bedding change updates from bucks in the fall. Like say I have a west wind and then it switches to even, a south or a southeast, I'll actually have deer switch over on the ridge and cross this ridge if it's, somewhat thick, it seems like is what I'm seeing. But so a lot of the movement now that I see with the big bucks, instead of like dropping down, they'll actually come up and around and they'll just find that one spot to get over into this hub and then they'll go down. And so that just gives
Mhm.
them, they're not getting the pressure. They're not getting annoyed like they were before by humans a lot of times. It gives them more of a buffer.
Yeah.
What that looks like for me is like, I never used to really scout the ridge tops, but there's two like types of scrapes that I see on ridge tops or even types of rubs. Like one is I'll see the linear buck rubs or scrapes down the top of the ridge where like the 2 year olds are running it during the rut, right? Or at night. But then
Hmm.
every once in a while, I'll find a cross trail. Like you'll find a very faint trail. It might be in Greenbrier, might be, barely identifiable. And it doesn't run the ridge this way. It will actually just do that hub hop. And man, if you find one of those, I used to walk past them because I just thought it was that travel down the ridge. But if you find that, that could be a killer spot where a buck is actually outsmarting most people and just jumping over the ridge at night. And you will catch them on top of the ridge. What I've noticed is big bucks don't like running down the spines, but they have no problem at all crossing that ridge top like that. If it's a narrow ridge, if it's and if there's not a lot of pressure up top, there's a lot of variables. But where I hunt, I've seen that a lot recently.
Do
So
you do you mostly see? I got a couple questions for you here. Do you mostly see that during the rut, or do you see that all year long?
so I'm seeing it right now. I'll see it early season. I'll see it late season. Late season actually quite a bit. Like if I haven't seen a lot of deer bedding. We haven't had a ton of acorns lately. And so they're actually bedding further away and then they're traveling to a lot of the food sources they have. And I'm seeing a lot of that happening. A lot of this might be pressure that I've induced myself into some of these areas that have pushed these deer out of these areas. Like, you got to think you're inducing pressure just like everybody else is. And for a long time, I didn't recognize that. And then as I got older, I'm like, yeah, I'm stinky just like everybody else is, right? Like I'm going in here and I'm walking down the bottom of this thing and that buck comes down and he's like, man, I'm sick of smelling Jake. I'm going to go over here and hide now. But yeah, to
Hmm.
answer your question, I am seeing that travel pretty much the entire year. And then the more factors you stack in, the better it gets. Like
Yeah.
if you can imagine having a clear cut right in here in this bowl where you have a hard edge, well, you might have, or a clear cut over here even that kind of protrudes over the top of it. That hard edge line will be a great travel route. Or Southern Ohio, we've got a lot of greenbrier or multiple rows on top of the ridges. And I'll see a lot of the deer following that the same way. What you'll actually see a lot too, sometimes it's not even a scrape. Sometimes, like if you have waist high greenbrier, sometimes all you'll find is just like a browsed area of the greenbrier that looks like it would be a trail. Now it's still, let's say 12 inches below your waist, but so it's not like it's all the way down to the ground and it's a defined trail, but you can see where that deer has been just like nipping on that greenbrier as he's crossing the top of that ridge. And that tips me off the same way. I'm like, okay, there's a travel route here on the spine of this ridge crossing over that's very faint. And that's one of the big things to me, I think. Like if it's a hammered trail over the top of the ridge, I might not be as excited about it because a lot of deer are doing it. But if all you're finding is like a browsing pattern in a trail and there's not a ton of, the leaves aren't kicked up real bad or there's not like a beat down trail, it's probably only like one or two deer doing it. And I bet you it's a big old smart buck,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. And there's something I find interesting about this is um, they're incentivized a lot more often to go up, to go upward, as we'll see in like the next example, with a lot of their food sources being up top um, for a lot of the year. But in the late season, as that foliage comes off, I see them in Wisconsin, at least when I hunted the hills in my my situations and my experience, I saw them going down more, and I theorized that they were going down more when those leaves are off because they're monitoring what's below them all day long. And then they're, catching those dropping thermals as well and all the other advantages they get to going lower. Um, so it's interesting to me that that buck is foregoing what he may have been looking at. But like you're saying, if you're combining edge, you're combining thick habitat, and it's happening all year long, you're probably that deer's probably not visually getting a lot of information from below him. He's certainly not getting in the afternoon any bit of a thermal or wind advantage. And especially if he has that thick cover up top. And I actually am relating this right now. Remember that first really nice buck on the property I ended up killing on, that came by me, did kind of the exact same thing where we thought he was going to go from that hog's back into that turn, and he was going to come right along where I was sitting, and he just dodged. Well, it kind of makes sense. He literally went over that spine and hopped into the next hub. We knew he was trying to locate some does that were around earlier. So that kind of makes sense, especially in that case. And a lot of the rut studies we've done in recent podcasts, we did one with like Bronson Strickland, and he was talking about how they often take very direct lines of travel. So like this makes a lot of sense, especially when they're doing it for the motivation of dodging pressure. They're following an edge. They have their faint trail that they go on, and they're motivated and moving in a different way than a lot of the other deer are, because a buck is motivated by different things than the vast majority of other deer, like does, which are more plentiful typically, and young bucks and other stuff like that. An experienced buck will move with purpose and move to survive, it seems like.
Yeah, 100%. And another thing too, when they're crossing the ridge, I think most people think of a saddle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's more than possible. Like it could be possible that they're crossing through a saddle. I don't think I haven't had very much success with very mature deer in big saddles. I know this has been talked about before. Like the micro terrain features are going to probably be more productive in most situations. So one thing that I started doing to figure that out is I actually started just using the 3D map, and this turns out pretty good on my phone. Let's see how it works here.
You can
See,
exaggerate that terrain too. It'll look,
that's what I need to do.
yeah, go about halfway. Otherwise, it'll start getting crazy on you. I did this. I very extremely exaggerated the terrain in Nebraska so I could figure out what points of ridges, like in those rolling sand hills, will be just higher so I can get good glassing knobs. It helped a lot.
So this is a great example. And actually check this out right here. What do we got going on there? A
Yeah.
thicket?
Oh, that's like
Okay.
CRP or something, maybe. Or
Yeah. So that could be a great spot for them to
that's really
cross.
cool.
But so basically, if you look at this, like we're way up over top of the fields, right? I mean, this is textbook for me. And I would access from down below. If I have a camera on this first hub, that main hub, there's actually a couple in here, but one of the hubs that we talked about, well, if he's daylighting here, I'll try to kill him here, right? And then if not, I'll try to come up where he's crossing. And like, if I think he's in this bowl, I'll set up right on this point, right? But if I'm sure that he's doing the hub hop and the cross, I'll end up working my way up this ridge. And the thing about this spot is with say you have a south wind, but say it's not perfect. If it's a light south wind and you're set up over here trying to kill this deer, making a loop or either dropping down and coming up, your thermals are going to start dumping like crazy in the afternoon when he's making that move. So what I like to do is make sure that I'm on the other side of the spine. And what that's doing is my thermals are pulling down the other drainage. So it might sound really simple, but there's a lot of setups where that's actually pretty hard to pull off. This one's pretty easy, right? Like as long as I would be very careful about this because you're going to get some thermal pull into this little bowl right here. And he might know that, right? He might come around and he might want to scent check into this and come down or even come this way. But I almost guarantee you when he comes over, he's going to try to get here to smell if there's anything up here that's danger as well. Like if your prevailing's coming from west to east like this, he's going to want to try to get in here and check that before he makes his move. Another reference I have right here, this is another very thin spot that I could see him crossing. So maybe he does the move down, thermals in his face on the way up. Is there any danger? No.
Mm.
Okay, I can hop over and then I'm gone, which then maybe we get him down here or we get him right off the backside of this ridge here.
And
But
that
the
would work
whole,
especially well in a scenario where he can see right below him and you can't target him on that first drop. You've got to
oh,
target him on that second one.
yeah, absolutely. So the whole idea though is, I mean, this gives a great view. Like this looks perfect. If you're in the ag, a lot of times I'll use the drainages for access for my advantage, and then I'll stay in those. I'll work up through whatever drainage I need to, and that's just kind of how I make it work. Like even if he's coming down through here, you can see even all these little tiny drainages. I've used all of these at some point to access. Like even this cut right here, right? Like say he's
Mm-hmm.
bedded right here. Well, I can come in from here, work my way around and get set up on him as he drops down. So that's like I would say one of my, if I have anything going for me in the woods, I would say it's my access. I feel like I'm pretty creative with it, and when I get real creative with it, it seems like I have the most success. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. I think that that's just the fact that those deer aren't expecting that because they never really see humans do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I would go down through this whole area and kind of do that same thing, right? And I mean, I would still scout all of this because you could have one, say you have a fallen tree up here or like a clear cut would end right here or something. You might have great bedding right here and he's never been pressured. Um, Another thing that I really look for is if these fields are private, it's it's like a 10x for me right away because you can't just access from the road, right? You have to
Mm.
find a way to get creative. And in that example, I'll give you an example last year of a deer I chased. Let's say he's bedded like in here, right? Well, I had a road behind me up high, kind of the same situation. And what I would do is like he's bedded here. Let's say that we have just a straight west wind, right? So he's in here. Well, I would either come in from down here and do my own hub hop, and then I basically will stay on either down low or I'll stay on this side of these ridges and work my way all the way around and then come down the front of them. And then I'm J hooking in. Like if you've ever heard the story of Dad's buck was me hugging a property line, skipping over ridges like this, which is the hardest way to access. You're you're a sponge by the time you get to the stand, like you're just soaked in sweat. But making these big jumps and then actually running the front of the ridges like this and then J hooking in. So that deer is not expecting, he's never seen anybody coming off the private. That private doesn't get hunted, but you don't have access through it. Typically, people will just crash down in and hunt him or crash down the ridges he's on or the adjacent one. But sometimes making these loops, and the only place you really have to be careful is your prevailing wind. Like if you got a southwest, well then I wouldn't come through here and then blow my scent over that way, right? Like maybe I'd come in over here on the opposite ridge and then do that same J hook. It depends on property lines. It depends on the wind direction, on where you think that buck's bedded. Um, but I would say that like that, if you turn what could be a 500-yard access into a mile-and-a-half access, I feel like your odds are going to be a lot better in situations like that because you're undetectable. Now, a lot of times, what's crazy is a lot of times I'll crash down through these and I'm busting deer out all over the place. And I'm like, well, hopefully, that could be another good one, or that's a doe or a little buck or whatever. And then I get over here and I end up killing that deer back in this system because I made that creative access. So in this situation though, I would go down through all of these and kind of have that same talk with myself. I really like if this was ag, I would really like to see some sort of bedding, maybe even over here. Like I see maybe there's a little thicket there. But let's say there's bedding in here somewhere, right? And they could drop down, but if he does want to be over here, there's a good chance he comes through this and then works his way down. And you might catch him on your hub down in the bottom still, and you might be able to kill him there even if you have the right wind. But if you have to get up on those ridges, just know that there are times when people are doing that and they're having a lot of success doing it. So it's not all about hunting low, it's about hunting where you need to be based on your situation.
Yeah. Absolutely. I've got so many questions going off in my head because, man, and I say this to people when they ask about you, and you'll never admit this, but just the opportunity to come back to your house and talk shop with you about what we saw during the day and how we are going to adjust, and looking at maps and your understanding of how the deer travel. Like, of everyone I've talked to, I feel like you have the greatest understanding for how the deer are using the land, and how that deer is going to travel and what that deer is thinking, of absolutely everyone I've talked to for any extended period of time. And seeing you break this stuff down makes me want to ask you a lot of really, really particular questions. And I guess to get right into it, leeward wind bedding. I'm going to preface this with a little bit about me so you can think about your motivations for this. But when I hunted hill country, almost always counted on them betting on a leeward wind. I thought that my best odds were a mature buck is going to be monitoring where the pressure is coming from. The pressure in our area is generally coming from the top, so he's almost always going to be bedded leeward. And when I went back and I checked my trail camera data, I literally saw bucks bedded on windward sides. It was almost a 50-50 to when I had leeward winds in a relatively well pressured area. Now, what is your mentality with? I know a lot of the examples you've been covering are leeward winds. What's your mentality with leeward winds? Are you trusting that a buck is going to be bedded in a leeward wind situation, or are you understanding that specific deer that you're chasing and you're keying in on his tendency to do so? Is it more like, this is the rule, I'm going to follow it, or is it, I know this deer and he uses this rule, so I'm going to follow that?
So I think one of the reasons that I focus on the prevailing wind direction the way I do is actually access based more than
Okay.
anything else. Um, to answer your question, then we'll get into why I feel that way. I believe a deer will bed wherever he needs to bed, windward, leeward, top of the ridge, middle of the ridge, bottom of the ridge, in the creek. Like, I don't think that I don't think that that matters a whole lot. You need to figure that out about the individual deer. I think that what the leeward thing does to me is it puts me in areas like this, right? Where if I get in this area and I have travel from west to east with a west wind, like if the deer are coming down and they're doing this and I'm accessing and J hooking in with the wind in my face, I'm just at such an advantage to kill that deer. My efficiency just skyrockets if that deer is doing what I want him to do, right? And so like when I look at this, I'm like, okay, say I go to a new state, I move to Ohio, for example. Well, I'm looking for stuff like this to find the locations I want to hunt because I want to find deer that are very killable, right? Like I want to find deer like, okay, if I find 50 of these systems like this and I scout them all and I find the good sign, I break them down to the top 5 or 10, chances are there's going to be a good buck in there he's grown up with natural tendencies based on this topography here, which is going to set him up to be killed easier than other situations, if that makes sense. Like that's really
Mm-hmm.
that's my motivating factor, is the fact that I think I can kill these deer easier. What I would say is, like, over the years, I do think that the majority of bucks I've chased have somewhat of a windward or a leeward bedding pattern. I would say that, I don't know percentage wise, but it seems like more often than not, they prefer leeward. But some of the best bucks I've chased have been the exact opposite. The buck that I've chased for a couple years loves bedding windward. And it threw me off a lot at first because I kind of got stuck in my own head and was a little bit, overconfident with what I believed about deer patterns. And it took me longer than it should have to track that deer down. But that was a great learning lesson, right? Like that just validates this whole situation, that I think that they'll do what they have to do. If the leeward side, because it's been talked about on podcasts for 10 years now, is getting a ton of pressure, well, the windward side could be where a lot of your deer are at. Or if you go in and you just scout leeward, you don't even look at the windward side of these, you might be missing out on an entire population of good deer. I think that's why I go to the bottoms, because it's such a like a concentration point for the deer that whether they're leeward or windward, at some point they're going to come through there and I'm going to get the photo. And that's the thing. Like if I get a photo of a deer here, I'm not assuming he's bedded here. He could be anywhere in this system, but now I need to figure that out, right?
Hmm.
But the biggest thing for me is knowing that the majority of the time the wind will set up a way where I can come in, I can get set up on that deer, and whether I have to get in here, whether I have to come down in here, whether I'm hunting this hub hop here or these ones we talked about earlier, I can access that in an efficient manner, and I feel like I'm more undetectable than if he's on the windward side. So that's where it really comes from for me.
So essentially, it's a mixture of how is that buck telling you he's vulnerable, and what is the situation in which he's vulnerable that you can be the most efficient killer possible.
Exactly. And like another train of thought I have is, say that a deer could be bedded on. I mean, look at how beautiful the topography is in this
Yeah,
system. All of
it's
these points,
gorgeous.
right? So if I come crashing down through, if I have any philosophy in my head that makes me come crashing down anywhere on this ridge to try to hunt a deer in this system, I'm coming down the ridge and I'm making a ton of noise and I might fall and I can't see myself being successful like that. And then it's like, okay, well, if I have a crosswind, my wind's going to be all swirly. And so that just sets me up in my head for failure. I'd much rather come in like this and be able to
Yeah.
hunt that deer with the wind in my face.
It's like
And
you're starting at the lowest risk point too, and progressively working towards your riskiest areas, like where he's potentially bedded in the more complex terrain, you know. So versus crashing down that drainage, it's like you're starting where he'll likely end up, being bedded, and you're going high risk down to lower risk. It seems backward.
yeah, exactly. And just to elaborate, like say this is an ag field, I've killed deer right here on the edge of the field, right? I've killed them coming off the first ridge, um, obviously back in the hub because that's like my favorite thing, and then working your way into these micro hubs. And so I think that you need to look at your situation, look at the deer that you're after. Do you have a logging road that runs down the middle of this thing, or is it wide open, or does the ag go further back? All that's going to play into it. But I think that you need to just find a way to efficiently hunt as aggressive as you need to. And you don't have to go shoot for the stars your first shot, right? Like, don't come in and come all the way back into this micro because if he's bedded out here, you're going to feel really silly when you bump him off that ridge, right? And so, if you don't have the intel you need, I would more stage myself into some of these hunts until I find what I need. Like if I'm coming down through and I'm like, oh wow, there's I can see the trail drop off this ridge. This scrape's hammered, and all these scrapes have pee in them from this morning. Well, I'm gonna hunt that deer right here. I'm just gonna like that feels right to me. The wind's doing what it should. And one thing to note too is I've talked about this before, but since we have a map, it's easier to explain. The wind, if you have a crosswind like a south, you'll get a ton of swirl in these ridges. If you have more of a west or whatever way the drainage is flowing, first off, you have to think about it. This is higher elevation than here, right? So if you have a elevation drop at night, your thermals somewhat are going to pull down through here in most situations. Now, if you have any sort of prevailing wind, it's going to help your thermals push out. But if you have a crosswind, you're going to get the swirl. So I try to hunt these on days that the wind direction, the prevailing wind lines up best as possible without being too strong because then you start getting into some weird things. Like for example, I hunted a buck like basically right off something like this, and he was bedded up in here, and he was dropping down, coming across, and I wanted to kill him right here. And what would happen is I'd go in on a west wind and I felt good. But I went in one night on a west wind that was like 25 miles an hour, and it was actually blowing over the top of this ridge, and it created a venturi and sucked my scent all the way back up into all those deer, and I blew the whole valley out. But the wind was right; it was just too strong, and it created a venturi effect. Wind blowing over top. So
Right.
there's just a lot of factors that go into it, but those are some of the biggest ones I've seen.
That's really interesting. To point out just a little similarity with you talked a little bit about the the scrape, the sign, where you're gonna find it. Um, I'll give this example and I'll ask you a question along those lines. Take your cursor, Jake, and move straight south right now. Or yeah, yep, a little bit left. I'm leading you a top that kind of creates a hub. It's kind of like a saddle. Keep going left, north. Yep, right there.
Okay.
So see how that is like where a bunch of ridges meet together on a top, like kind
Yeah.
of where your
Yeah.
cursor is at right there. That is like where I in areas that deer rise and you're dealing with a lot of different like oaks and such. That is where I often see a scrape where they're not lowering as often. And that's usually like a preseason to early season kind of scrape scenario because they're rising to hit those oaks that have greater sun exposure that drop a little bit earlier. And so that's like a killer survey location preseason to get a bunch of velvet bucks. And then as they're rising, that's a great area. And then there's usually like a gap in the season towards the quote unquote lull and whatnot when you're transitioning between whites to reds, or if you don't have reds, you might go all the way to the pre-rut. But then it's a place that you'll see bucks do a lot of that hub hopping, and you'll just get those weird day walkers all throughout. Um, and so it's really interesting because it's basically if you took the inverse of the scenario you're pointing out, they're kind of doing a similar thing where I'm not targeting them right in the middle of that point, but I'm more cutting them off, closer to their bedding. It's just kind of like the reverse scenario where one might be going off of one of those little sub ridges and then winding back around and then eventually hitting that hub. And he might hit that hub on the top in, 40 minutes, an hour after dark. But if you cut him off, with that leeward wind, it's actually really, really hard to hunt them on a leeward wind on the top side. But there's ways you can do it by like being at the top of a drainage and trying to get your wind to suck down that drainage. I've seen like really similar things to what you're talking about. It's really cool that it's like the same scenario, but a bit inverse. And I wanted to say, like, you're talking about how you're discovering that a deer beds in a certain wind scenario. And a lot of people are like, that's great. But a lot of people really struggle to figure out that the deer is using that. They struggle to figure out a deer's weakness. And this is a loaded question, but if you could give kind of like one or two examples of like the best ways that you find the most often tools you use in order to figure out if a deer has a tendency based on wind. It could be trail cameras, hunting experience, sign, something like that. But what are two quick tips you'd give someone for that?
Yeah. So I think the number one thing that you can do in hardwoods is going to be running your trail cameras. These, like, man, if you have ag down low specifically and you're catching that deer, like say he's, based on wind bedded anywhere in here, but you're going to catch him coming down these ridges, different directions, and then leading out. And then even in the morning, you'll catch him come in, hit the scrape, and then he'll head up one way. Well, if you cross reference that with wind direction, a lot of times it'll make a lot of sense to you. South wind, it's like, okay, he's dropping down here. North wind, or let's say northeast wind or northwest wind, he's coming down this way. I've just had a lot of success being able to put that piece of the puzzle together. And maybe I don't kill him here, but maybe I'm like, all right, well, on a northwest, I know he's coming from this way. So I'm just gonna follow the sign, and I pre-scouted it. So maybe there's a bed here, maybe there's a bed here or in here. And I'm just gonna get as close as I think I need to based on the fact that he's coming down and hitting this camera that direction. So
Yeah.
that's the first way to do it. The second way to do it is just by observing deer. And time in the woods is the greatest tool that we have. Boots on the ground, time in the woods. But I think there's a lot of emphasis on like scouting miles and how much time you're spending out there. There's not a ton of emphasis on just like being in the hills and the hardwoods and observing, right? Like just observe. And, it kind of brings me back to being a kid again, where I was just in awe of the forest. Like just go for a walk and go sit down on a ridge and just see what happens before dark. You'd be amazed at where you see deer come from. Take a good set of binos or a spotter. One thing that I really like to do, let's say that this whole chunk right here is a clear cut, right? This whole thing is a 1 or 2 year old clear cut. It's knee high or waist high, ton of good browse, whether it's summer or in season or in the winter. I love coming in the adjacent ridge however I can, like up through here, and getting
Mm-hmm.
set up somewhere in here and just glassing that clear cut. And the amount of things that you learn by glassing deer. My buddy Ethan Eskew is one of the best that I know at glassing. I mean, he has located some gigantic bucks in West Virginia in the hills glassing, and what like he'll glass a power line or like a CRP thicket or just about anything. But the you learn so much more from, like, in my opinion, you learn more from glassing and observation than any other tool that we'll ever have, because you're seeing everything about that deer. You're seeing the attitude, you're seeing his tendencies, you're seeing exactly what tree he walks by today, for example, or what scrape he hits, or maybe there's a rub halfway up the ridge that he hits before he hits like a couple different scrapes down here in a different direction. So maybe that's his focal point. Like I saw that in Kentucky, a big signpost rub coming off a bed, and then that deer can make a lot of decisions. But the focal point is a signpost rub 2/3 of the way up the ridge, right? So I mean, I like for me, I love deer hunting, but I also just love spending time in the woods. And so it's very easy for me to go in there and just like it's relaxing. It's you know I just really thoroughly enjoy being out there. And so I can go spend a night, I can take my boy and just go glass or observe and have no problem with that whatsoever. Even if you have a logging road that comes in, like there's an easy way to access, just get in there and drop off and just see what happens. If you have suspicion there's a deer in any of these systems, it's one of the best things you can do. What I would say is just try to play it right. Try to make sure your wind's right so you're not leaving scent or leaving any sign of you being there. But in a lot of these systems, like, if this is 400 yards across, for example, you're pretty safe up in here anywhere, especially if you have a south blowing the majority of your wind out. Like I'm not really overly concerned with a little bit of thermal drop. I haven't had, like, if he's coming down here, this is a clear cut, like, okay, maybe your thermal's dumped, but if he's not coming all the way down, he might not ever smell that if he's staying up here. You know what I mean? So I just I just try to figure out whatever I can to learn about that deer. And I think that just observing is something that we don't talk about a whole lot. Another good tactic is early season. If you don't have a beat on a deer, you're learning, you're trying to figure out bedding, what better time to go figure that out than like within a month of season, right? They're already kind of staged up back on the acorns. Food sources are shifting, because a lot of times, like if this is beans, you might not see these deer in the hills for months until they shift back off the beans. So like I know a lot of guys that have cameras loaded up in areas like this. They go check all their cameras in August or even early September, and they pull all their cameras because there's no deer there, but there's a giant buck out here feeding that ends up here in another month. And so I think that understanding that shift, but yeah, I don't know. I just think that we get really caught up in chasing the buck or in the kill. And a lot of times, for me anyways, it's like get back to the roots and just enjoy being out there. And it's actually very productive.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you're when you're observing a deer, there's absolutely no uncertainty. Like you literally have your eyes on it, what it's doing. I've seen times that like I'll watch a deer come from the north to a camera, mill around for a second, and then exit to the south. And I'll get that picture on my camera, and he'll be facing south at the time, and I'll be like, oh, if I would have saw that, I would have thought he was coming from, or he'll be facing north, and it looks like he's coming from the south, and it's like, who knows if that deer did a little cartwheel real quick, or something like that. So when you're seeing a deer and you're seeing his demeanor and you're taking the notes, like there's absolutely no mistake what's going on. It's just up to you to record the conditions at the time and really make those observations and draw conclusions from it. So that's a very good point, and absolutely Ethan is amazing at that. You can look at his track record and see. But another thing I wanted to touch on is when you're going into an afternoon hunt and a deer beds there on a west wind. So let's say it's going to take you 2 hours to get in there and you need to be set by 4 p.m. What wind, when you're looking at your weather data, what time are you looking at the winds? Like, what are you looking at the wind direction? What time of day are you checking for?
So I want to be set up by what time?
So I'm trying to make it so you don't worry too much about your access. So like let's say you want to be set up by 4 and it's going to take you from 2 to 4 to get there. And it'll absolutely take exactly 2 hours. Let's say there's no uncertainty in the access.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm typically cross-referencing wind directions by the hour for the whole day. Like I'll on days that I hunt the afternoon, I'll wake up in the morning and that's basically what I'm like. That's my day, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
gonna have breakfast and get everything ready, and I'm gonna check the wind, make sure conditions are right, make sure I'm ready to go, and I'm gonna go try to make that hunt happen. So for me, like I'm gonna shift it back even a little. Well, we can do 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock's fine. But I'm definitely gonna be looking at the wind direction while I'm accessing as well. And a lot of times that wind is shifting, right? Like you'll have a west wind to start, and then it's gonna end up southwest, for example, or be west wind to start, and then it's gonna end up northwest. Sometimes it'll switch to an east and completely blow out the valley if you're
Hmm.
in there. Like I had that happen one time on uh gigantic typical. I told the story, but I was set up in like a hub. I didn't check the uh, wind that day because I got in a car accident and I was like, I shouldn't even been out there hunting. I was loopy pretty much, but I got set up and he was on the bed and my wind shifted dead east like it was supposed to, like it was forecasted. I should have never been in that system. And I just heard his nasally snort all the way up and then he was out of the county pretty much over there.
Yeah.
So not ideal, but yeah, I'm definitely looking at wind directions as I'm accessing. Like for example, say I have a couple different systems, but I'm looking at this one. I'm like, okay, throughout the day, I've got a northwest wind and then it's going to switch to a west, right? Well, man, that gives me the perfect opportunity with a little bit of north to be able to flank down through here and make that J hook access. But if that same situation, like say we end the same way with a west, but during my access, it's a southwest, well, maybe I come in from over here and skip down and come across this direction, right? And so
Hmm.
I think everybody looks at the end wind direction, but in the hills specifically, you have to be very, very careful about what it's doing while you're accessing. Because if you've got like for example, if you have a little bit of south or a little bit of north and you're accessing from here, well, your wind, say you get on down in here, all of a sudden your thermals pull up and then that south takes it right over to the buck bed. Even in a totally different system, he could know you're there. I'm not saying he will, but there's a chance, right? And so
Hmm.
for me, I would say that like access wind is just as important as kill wind in a lot of situations. I feel like I've got away with like an odd wind more than once just based off thermals dropping at night. But your access during the day, your thermals are pulling up typically. So you have to be really careful with that. One thing that you can do too, for example, like say you think the buck is bedded. Let me shift this a little bit. This is a situation I ran into in Kentucky. Say you think the buck's bedded like right here, right?
Hmm.
Well, what I want to do when I'm on my way in, say I still have my west wind, I come in down like this, which is basically my exact route that day. I'm going to do everything I can to hug this ridge over here because my thermals are getting pulled out, right? So like throughout the day, it's hot, it's 90 some degrees. I'm hugging this, my thermals are getting pulled, right? Like especially if you have maybe a little crosswind. As soon as you hit this ridge with milkweed, I mean your milkweed just sucks up the sunlit ridge, right? And so
Hmm.
use that to your advantage. Use that thermal pull to your advantage so you're not pulling up scent down in this bottom. Because if you pull up your scent and you get one bad swirl, it could pull up to them real fast. Like I'm sure if you've hunted the hills long enough, you've experienced it. You're like, man, the wind's in my face. How did that deer blow and smell me? So that's something I like to use a lot is just stay right on the edge, right in the sun, and then right at the last minute, I'll kind of drop where I need to be. Or sometimes I'll even stay over here for a little bit and then I'll make my move. Like what I like to do a lot of times is I'll sit like right in here on the Sunface Ridge and I'll wait and I'll listen for squirrels. I'll listen for acorns drop out of the trees. I'll try to get an understanding of, the squirrels were down here last week, but now it sounds like they're way in here. Okay, I need to push a little bit further than I thought I did to try to get on that feed tree, all the while maintaining your thermals. And I like you can see how elaborate access can be, right? There's a lot of
Hmm.
things that go on. And sometimes you can't get it right. Like sometimes the recipe is going to be a disaster and you just have to be able to accept that. But But I think like getting creative with, playing around with how your thermals are playing around with that prevailing wind. The speeds are definitely going to have a drastic impact. The exact prevailing wind, like if it's got a little bit of south, I would be very nervous about hunting this because as soon as it hits that, it's going to pull back around and start to swirl on you. Those are all things that are going through my head. So, I mean, I hope that answers your question. I would say that I'm always worried about it. And then the speed is just as important. And I don't trust one app. I have to trust like
Mm-hmm.
two, sometimes even three apps. I really like a Windy or a Ventusky. I think they're designed for maybe parasailing. Like they're pretty accurate. They have really good wind currents and everything. I use those more often because I feel like there's a little bit more accuracy there.
Yeah. Yeah, and that definitely answers my question. It's a question I really like asking a lot of hill country guys, because the way that they answer it often reveals a bit about their strategy, their mentality, and also the pressure in their area, and specifically the buck they happen to be thinking about at the time when they're explaining the example too, because it changes. But what I like to point out with that question is if we are assuming that bucks are reaching their beds before daylight and they're making their decision based on the wind, then we should be making our decision on where they originally bed at least, based on the wind that was before daylight. And so the fact that you're looking at the whole day, really adds to that. And I think bucks are, potentially shifting more in some scenarios than others where, you may only need to look at the wind in the afternoon because that buck is going to shift to adjust to whatever that wind is going to be in the afternoon. There's some examples that you've explained as well that you're specifically only targeting the buck if the wind shifts in such a certain way. And, he's ultra vulnerable when that happens. I'm going to share my screen for a second here. And I'm just going to show this example. So if you look at this here, and I'm trying to pick this example to show this point, but if you look and there was a wind that was kind of southwest as the morning came, right? This buck, his only option, maybe with the exception of here, but say this is just a flatline ridge, right? Southwest, this is his only chance to really be on a knob or a point to be leeward for that wind.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's say that, 2:00, that wind is going to shift and it's going to start to go like southeast or a little more east based, so east southeast. Now this might be a half a mile, right, for him to now get leeward another point. So if I went and I only looked at that wind, and if this is wide open hardwoods, that buck is probably not going to shift all the way over here to, he's not going to put himself in an extremely vulnerable situation over half a mile period of open hardwoods midday to just be leeward again. A lot of the times they're buttoning up closer to this ridge, or maybe they're dropping further down and they're relying on a visual and they'll be able to hear anything coming over the top to them. But a lot of the times, like if a guy just looked at what the wind was going to be 1:00 and on, he would probably be set up down here for this buck to drop down in this hub. But if he would have looked at the wind situation that was happening when the buck actually decided to bed there in the morning, he probably would have set up down here somewhere and caught that buck coming down. And so that's why I think it's crucial for people to really look at the wind in the morning and throughout the day and, relate it to the specific deer they're chasing. But I just wanted to make that point, and I think it's really good that you have that in mind. And I want to emphasize to everyone that you're looking at everything within the scope of the deer that you're chasing. And, that maybe there's a situation that prevails like crazy on a property, and you're hunting either that situation or you're hunting that deer. And you're looking at what is going to get that deer killed and the way that you most efficiently can kill that deer on top of it. So a lot of these answers you're giving me are covering all those situations because you've chased many deer in many different situations. So I would emphasize to the listener, it's really important that you employ tactics that allow you to learn what you're chasing and learn the situations that the deer specifically in your area abide by. Because everyone's pressure is going to be different. Everyone's definition of high, middle, low pressure is different. The ag is going to be slightly different. In some areas, it's going to be on top. It's going to be on bottom. You're going to deal with native browse that sometimes is more important for you to target during daylight because it's a secondary food source that's all they're going to reach in daylight in some areas. So like I would say get really good at analyzing your current situation, whether that be through the examples you talked about, like trail cameras, observation, just your experience on hunts, or any other method that you find really efficient. Get really good at analyzing your situation and find out how that deer or the general deer in your area act and how you need to target them in order to kill them. Because these are all really good tips, but it's going to be really specific to your situation that you're getting after.
I couldn't have said that better myself. Totally agree.
I appreciate that. That's probably the only thing I could say fairly cleanly about this, man. I feel like I've consumed so much here, and I don't even. I mean, I drew up a little area to cover with open tops, but like honestly, this has been so great, and I don't really want to like confuse anyone with giving them a whole different example and restarting from scratch with that. I would say that on my YouTube channel, The Wild Calling, I've done e-scouting breakdowns with Ag on Top, and I did a podcast with Josh Talker, it's like episode 51 or 81 or something like that, where we did a live e-scouting breakdown, and it was for the inverse example where there's more topside movement, topside ag. But I'll also say, like, I'm not the most experienced dude in the world, so my statement rings true. Like, you should be definitely getting good at analyzing your situation and employing these tactics. And I think, Jake, one thing I forgot to point out is that your access is really off the wall, right? And some of these deer that you've killed, especially the really special ones, are doing something off the wall. Like the one that I am targeting this year is doing something extremely off the wall. And I was just telling you before the podcast, I don't really think he's that smart of a deer. I just think he's predisposed to do something goofy, and no one thinks to hunt that way. So like you're seeing trends evolve where saddles kind of phased out a little bit, and now you're seeing hubs. You're seeing the way that you hunt hubs is starting to change. I would say that the people that stay settled in their ways are the ones that aren't going to progress and get better and adapt to how those deer are adapting to you. And the ones that keep looking at their situation with an open mind and truthfully learning about it are the ones that are going to continue to succeed. So while some of this might be confusing to you guys, I would say really focus on honing in on what your quarry is doing and keep trying out theories and testing them. And soon enough, that time in the woods, like we talked about earlier, is going to develop you into either a really efficient killer in the situation that you're experienced with, or you're going to become someone like Jake Bush, Andy May, like people that constantly are trying to challenge themselves in new situations with new deer. And, they're evolving to every situation, and the weaknesses are starting to tick down and your strengths are starting to get more numerous. So you see them killing in different situations. And I know you're going to like be all bashful here, but like, dude, I watched you pass on a 150 last year, and like, people's definition of success are very, very different. So, while you don't see Jake holding a booner the last 2 years, just know he passed on things that would make me cry if I shot them in both years. So, if you're a guy that cares about results, be that as it may, but no matter what you say, dude, you have got this stuff really, really dialed. And I'm really, really thankful to be able to just pick your mind in general, but also be able to have you on a podcast like this and share this information with people. It's been extremely valuable to me, and I know it's going to help a ton of people out there like crazy.
Well, I appreciate that, man. I think I'll just leave it at, I hope if this has shown anything, it's of the uncertainty of the whole thing, right? Like there's a lot of ands or ifs or ors that are happening in my own head with this every single time that I go out. I think that, develop your strategy, be creative and have fun with it. And then at the end of the day, trust your gut. And you're going to trust your gut. You might make the wrong call, but eventually that gut decision is going to be the right call. And that's basically what I'm living by in the woods, is trusting my gut. And like it's wrong more than it's right, but every once in a while it's right. So yeah, I just hope that it shows that there's not like a specific bed or like a set way, or hey, he's gonna do this every time. Basically anything is possible in any hunting situation. We can just do things to up the odds, or up the favorability of the situation for us. So aside from that, Jacob, I really appreciate you having me on. It's been a while since I've been on any of these, so I'm gonna start getting back into it a little bit. I love talking deer, and Yeah, I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. You've got an open invite, and man, I look forward to the future conversations and just being able to be a consumer of your content again, and learning from you, man. And I know a lot of people are going to reach out and appreciate this. So, as a preemptive to them, thank you very much, Jake. I look forward to relaying a few screenshots of thank you messages later on. This has been
Yeah.
a great experience, man.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Appreciate it.